The cicadas are coming! The cicadas are coming! Yes, my friends, the dreaded, dastardly, prehistoric, noise-making, 17-year cicadas are about to start emerging from their underground lair. According to etymologists, that's bug scientists to you and me, the cicadas are due to make their appearance any day now, depending on how fast the ground warms up in your particular neighborhood. They're sort of like the groundhogs of the insect world. They usually come out in the first or second week of May, and I don't know whether they see their shadow or not, but they are very attuned to the temperatures outside. Unfortunately, in these crazy days of climate change, that schedule has been slightly disrupted this year. Because of a record-breaking cold snap across a large part of the country, their arrival has been delayed in some areas as they await just the right conditions for their grand entrance on the red carpet, or the green carpet if that's what you call the lawn outside your home or apartment. Now, why would this matter? And how is that important to those of us in a religious community like the Unitarian Universalists? Well, like so many other things, the cicadas are a metaphor, a symbol of something else, something more spiritual. In this case, for this morning's sermon, they're a symbol for rebirth, transformation, a re-emergence from someplace deep, dark, and mysterious. You see, the cicadas, like many of us in the human race right now, are on the verge of doing something very big, something rather groundbreaking. In the case of the cicadas, it really is groundbreaking, as they actually do come out of the ground. But for us human beings, it's not so much earth-shattering as it is history-making. For you see, my friends, many of us will soon be coming out of our own cocoons. With more and more people getting vaccinated in the United States, we're all going to be cautiously making our way towards the sunlight, trying to reclaim our lives after more than a year of pandemic isolation. Our leaders hope we can get back to a sense of normalcy once again. But is that all we want? Just returning our country to normal? I'm afraid that boat has already left the dock. Or anything but normal these days. Perhaps what is needed at this point in time is a little bit of perspective. The last time that Mother Earth experienced something as big and scary as COVID-19 was back in the Middle Ages, when the Black Plague hit. Of course, way back then, not many people even had a clue as to what was happening. Science and medicine were, for all intents and purposes, still stuck back in the Dark Ages. They had no frame of reference to understand it, let alone deal with it. They had nothing like the modern science and medical technology that we have today. Now here's the good news. Following those awful years of the Black Plague, when the world opened up again, an interesting thing happened. In many different ways, civilization changed for the better. Better sanitary practices came about, municipal sewer systems were put in place, and the field of medicine changed dramatically. One reason for this was that the plague had wiped out nearly all the doctors in Europe, bringing about a new generation of physicians, as well as new thinking in the practice of medicine. Superstition was left behind, and science reigned supreme. And the recent invention of the printing press made it possible to share this newly emerging medical knowledge with many others through textbooks about anatomy, pharmacology, and other specialties. One of the other things that happened was massive social change. A huge number of working people had also perished during the plague. So this unprecedented population decline created a serious shortage of labor. And peasants revolted against weak governments and high taxes, which ultimately led to the end of the feudal system, as well as the beginnings of the modern labor movements. and also led to an increase in wages and salaries. With fewer people to buy the goods that were produced, prices declined, standards of living rose, and people started to enjoy food of higher quality. Unfortunately, the plague had also wiped out a whole generation of clergy and other caregivers. Since pastors and priests were usually the ones called upon to care for the sick and dying, this exposure soon resulted in big changes for religion. With many clergy dying off as a result of the plague, the church experienced a rebirth of its own, with new pastors and priests eventually joining the fold, bringing with them some radical new thinking in theology and religion. So it was no coincidence that religious leaders like Martin Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, and others came on the scene, transforming religious practices for centuries to come. Even the concept of separation of church and state evolved during this period. And of course, the icing on the cake was the cultural revolution that also came about in those turbulent times. Much of the Italian Renaissance, and even the works of Shakespeare and other writers and artists, could actually be traced to the after effects of the plague. And those higher standards of living that I mentioned earlier translated to more spendable income, which of course directly benefited the arts. In our own times, as the end of our own pandemic nears, many reporters and commentators are already predicting a similar cultural revolution. Some are calling it a new roaring 20s, comparing it to the period right after the Spanish flu epidemic. The thing is, we reached back in history all the way to the Black Plague, as I just did, we might be closer to the truth of this bold new era that we're about to embark upon. Just like the cicadas, we're all going to be coming out of our hiding places very, very soon. And when that happens, look out, world! You've probably heard that old story about the butterfly and how interconnected we all are. A single butterfly flapping its wings all the way on the other side of the world, like in China, for example, can actually be a trigger for changing weather patterns in North America. And likewise, think about how many hundreds or even thousands of miles, 12,000 approximately, that a cloud of volcanic ash can travel halfway across the globe before its effects are felt in this country. Yes, my friends, a small event somewhere else on old Mother Earth could have a ripple effect that eventually reaches the town where you live. Because we are so interconnected, a new renaissance that arises out of the ashes of the COVID pandemic will be able to reach far and wide, ultimately improving life for everybody on this planet. Or at least that's the hope that many of us feel. You know, it's really interesting. When you stop and consider what kind of impact that ordinary people can have on the ongoing history of the world. In the past few weeks, I learned that one of my old favorite high school teachers passed away. But she wasn't just a favorite because she was friendly or likable or gave out good grades. Now, she was one of the handful of teachers who influenced my ultimate career choices. She was the one who encouraged my coming out as a creative writer and artist. And when I emerged from my personal cocoon, writing stories for the school newspaper, publishing a comic strip, and taking part in class plays and other dramatic productions, this helped set the stage for where I went to school and what I eventually did with my life, including going into ministry and creating sermons like the one you're listening to right now. How many other people out there have had a similar influence on us personally? Now think about those numbers, multiplied all across the world, just like the cicadas about to emerge from underground. Hundreds and thousands and millions of people experiencing comparable nudges into new directions for their lives. In this simple way, amazing transformations and history-changing revolutions can be started by one or two people in our lives. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't have this sort of a swelled head that makes me think that I'm making history or changing the world through my humble contributions. No, that's a role that other more inspiring people are much better suited to take on than me. But it does make you aware of how many interactions like that are happening every single day, every minute, every second, as our fellow interconnected human beings are helping us discover our true potential and leading us in new directions that will someday create a better world. Sure, we may complain about the toll that this pandemic has taken on us all, and there's no dispute about it. It has been an extremely horrendous experience for many. The death toll by some estimates is now around 7 million people. But if the experts are right, this too, like the Black Plague, could lead to an amazing new rebirth, a new renaissance that will make the original renaissance pale in comparison. This is not, of course, a suggestion that we celebrate the lives lost to COVID, but rather it's a way to find some small ray of hope in the tragedy that has occurred. As Rabbi Harold Kushner once wrote in the book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, the best thing we can do right now is to look for ways to turn our pain into something meaningful. Something that leaves us and our descendants with a lasting legacy, rather than a gaping hole in our hearts. How we respond to the catastrophe of COVID will determine where our civilization goes from here. We can keep lamenting our losses, or we can turn things around and make sure this kind of thing never happens again. There's another author, Arthur Pine, who shares a similar outlook on tragedies, disasters, and other unexpected misfortunes. In his book, One Door Closes, Another Door Opens, Pine describes a number of incidents in which people experienced earth-shattering setbacks, but came back from their losses to forge new lives, new careers, and new relationships that turned out to be even better than what they'd left behind. One great example of this is Carol Burnett. Remember Carol Burnett, the TV star? Well, at the start of her career, she moved to New York City with a dream of starring on Broadway. And she did get a chance to audition for a big part in a musical, but for one reason or another didn't make it. She was heartbroken. But miraculously, later that night, she got a phone call for another audition, this time as the lead in a musical called Once Upon a Mattress, which turned out to be a big, big hit. So after one door closed, another opened, and Carol Burnett was on her way to stardom. Another great example involved Robert Merrill, the famous Metropolitan Opera baritone. He auditioned once for a singing role at a nightclub in New York City, but was turned down. 1 year later, he happened to be auditioning for the Metropolitan Opera, and this time he did land the job. And only a year after that, he made his big debut singing in La Traviata. He later realized that if he had gotten the job at the nightclub, as he originally planned, the door to that starring role at the Metropolitan Opera would never have opened. There are plenty of other examples just like those. You may even know of a few yourself. The big thing to remember is a closed door may simply be a sign that fate has other plans for you. Life is full of surprises, and it doesn't matter how many times you fail. All you need is one success. You may have to reinvent yourself. You may have to consider unusual detours and other opportunities that temporarily take you away from your main goal. But in the end, persistence pays off. Your biggest break may come from never quitting. The darkest moments may ultimately turn out for the good. By the way, did you know who originally came up with the saying, "One door closes, another opens"? It was Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone. Now here's something even more interesting. The rest of the saying sheds light on a very common human tendency. The second half of Alexander Graham Bell's quote said, But we often look so long and so regretfully upon the closed door that we do not see the ones which open for us. How true. And so it is with the world around us at this moment in time. Because of the pandemic, we've all willingly endured many, many closed doors for more than a year now. And many of these were not of our own choosing. But we did it for the health and safety of ourselves and those we loved. We all climbed into our cocoons and stayed there until it was time for our big coming out party. Thankfully, we didn't have to wait 17 years like the cicadas for this to happen. But very soon it will be our time to shine once again. And as we all re-emerge, perhaps now is the time to ask a few key questions like, how do we want to do things differently this time? How do we want to redefine normal? What do we choose to keep? What do we leave behind? What parts of ourselves or our civilization do we want to change? If working from home is important to us, how do we assure that this continues? And if caring for others is important during times of crisis and tragedy, what can each of us do to be there for others as they were there for us? In the Christian world, this Sunday marks the observance of Pentecost, which is sort of like the first coming out party for Christianity as a religion. The disciples started speaking in tongues, and 3,000 people were baptized into the faith. The followers of Jesus, after some time meeting and worshiping in secret, finally got the opportunity to make their beliefs public. So essentially, Pentecost was sort of like the birthday of the church. Of course, as the years went on, centuries later, we have now evolved into different flavors, different theologies, different denominations: Catholic, Protestant, Baptist, Methodist, Unitarian, Universalist. But in the beginning, it all started with Christians coming out of isolation. Not too different from coming out of our homes after months of quarantining for the pandemic, I imagine. So how will you be celebrating this newest coming out party, this Pentecost for the 21st century? Are you ready for a new renaissance? Are you prepared to join together with others as we hammer out plans for a new world, a new culture, a promised land where people truly care for one another, regardless of race, religion, creed, political affiliation, gender preference, or other differences? If so, let's close those old doors and open new ones. Like the cicadas, we're ready to emerge from our cocoons, our burrows, our underground hiding places, and embrace the sunlight once again. Amen.